The auction yard smelled of dust and sweat, with a faint metallic scent of iron shackles in the air. The late summer sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the warped boards of the stage where people were once sold. But here, on the edge of the border, the law and sense of morality were somewhat behind the rest of the world. The men around him leaned forward like vultures and squinted at the barefoot girl standing on the podium. Her dress was simple, yet torn at the hem. Dust clung to the fabric. She didn't look anyone in the eye, until she did. A quick, sharp glance. Then she lowered her gaze again. That's when he saw it. It peeped out from under the frayed sleeve of her dress, a faded ink stain, black on pale skin. He thought it had disappeared from the face of the earth. His throat tightened. The murmur of the crowd faded into the pounding of his own heartbeat. He could almost feel the heat of a fire from years ago, smell the smoke and feel the burning on his temple. He could feel a small, calm hand pressing the same scarred wrist against his and guiding him through the darkness. $2, a voice barked from the crowd. The girl's child sank lower. Someone laughed. $3, another man called. His boots carried him forward without asking his permission. He heard his own voice before he had really thought. Stop! I'll buy her. The auctioneer froze mid-sentence and raised an eyebrow as if to check whether he was serious. The courtyard fell silent, except for the creaking of leather as men turned to stare at him. She looks strange, someone murmured from further back. You're wasting your money, Halan. But Halan's gaze was fixed on the faint tattoo and the memory it carried. Strange or not, it had once saved his life. She didn't look up as they pressed the key into his hand. He said nothing yet. They left the auction yard together. The noise faded away, and for the first time in years, Halan felt the past breathing down his neck. The sun was lower in the sky, bathing the prairie grass in bright colors as they reached his horse, tied to the post in front of the general store. Han untied the reins and helped her up without fuss. She moved stiffly, as if every step cost her something. They rode in silence. The land stretched out before them, rolling hills of dry grass and scattered oak trees. Cicadas began their evening song, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. 7 years had passed since he last saw this sign. 7 years since the raid on Coyote Ridge. Back then, he had been younger and more reckless, confident that he understood the rules of the West. But the West had its own rules, older than the railways and new towns springing up along the frontier. That night had taught him that. He remembered the glow of the fire dancing on the rock walls, the shouts in an unfamiliar language, the warmth of his own blood running down his cheek, and how she, despite also being young, had pulled him through a narrow gap between boulders and pushed him into the shadows as the flames blazed behind them. She had disappeared before he could say a word. Now she sat in front of him in the saddle, her shoulders hunched and the wind loosening strands of hair from the knot that had held them in place. As the sky darkened, his hut came into view. It was small and weathered, with smoke rising from the chimney. A dog barked once and then fell silent, wagging its tail as they approached. Inside, the air was warm from the fire he had stoked before leaving for the city. The girl entered cautiously. Her gaze wandered over the worn table, the single bed in the corner, and the shelves full of jars containing dried beans and cornmeal. He pointed to a chair. Sit down. She sat down, folding her hands in her lap and fixing her gaze on the floorboards. Halan busied himself with the kettle, filling it from a jug and placing it over the fire. The silence between them was not oppressive. It was more like the calm before a storm. Finally, he spoke. Do you remember me? She lifted her head slightly, and for a brief moment their eyes met. There was no recognition, or perhaps it was buried deeper, somewhere she didn't want him to see. "You saved me once," he said quietly, "a long time ago." She didn't answer, but her fingers, which were resting on the edge of the table, clenched into fists. Outside, the wind picked up and rattled the shutters. The prairie seemed to hold its breath. Halon knew that somewhere out there was the reason this girl was on the auction block, and if the past was anything to go by, disaster was not far behind her. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft and almost lost in the whistling of the kettle. "They're coming for me," she said. In that moment, Halon realized two things. First, she wasn't talking about the men in town. Second, he had just stumbled into something that would change his life again from the ground up. Hal didn't ask who they were. He didn't need to. The way she had said it, calmly and without fear, yet with an unshakable certainty, told him all he needed to know. Whoever they were, they had the will and the means to find her. He poured 2 cups of coffee, placed one in front of her, and took the other to the chair opposite. She wrapped her hands around the cup, but didn't drink. The firelight fell on the ink on her wrist, and he stared at it for a moment. The curved lines, the small geometric shapes, the faint scars where the skin had once been burned. "Name?" he finally asked. She hesitated. "Nita." He nodded slowly. "Nita," he repeated, as if testing the weight of the word. "I'm Halon." She didn't let on that she was interested. Her gaze was fixed in the distance, lost in her memories. People in town would already be talking. A man bringing home a girl from the auction, a girl who had no obvious value except trouble, was bound to attract attention. It didn't take long for that attention to turn to suspicion. Halon's next-door neighbor, Amos McSee, wasn't satisfied with mere suspicion. He preferred certainty. That's why less than 30 minutes later, Halon heard footsteps on his porch and the unmistakable sound of the door opening without a knock. "Halon." Amos's voice sounded like that mixture of curiosity and warning which never bodes well. "Heard you bought something downtown today." Nita stiffened, her fingers tightening around her cup. Hal stood up and opened the door wider. "What business is that of yours?" Amos was a big man with broad shoulders and a broad chin. His eyes always seemed to be assessing whether you were worth the bullet it would take to kill you. He leaned against the doorframe and looked past Hal to Nita. "She's causing trouble," Amos said tonelessly. "I heard she was picked up near Red Butte. They say she was involved in a raid." Har felt his jaw muscles move. "People say a lot of things." "Yeah, well, some of it's true. If you keep her here, half the county will be after you, demanding answers." Nita's gaze was now fixed and steady on Amos. She said nothing, but there was a sharpness to her eyes, as if she had sized him up instantly and found him lacking. Amos shifted under her gaze and spat into the dirt just behind the porch. "As you wish, Halon, but if there's trouble, don't say I didn't warn you." The door closed behind him, but the echo of his words lingered. Halon sat back down, feeling the weight of what he had just stepped into pressing even harder on his shoulders. "They'll come for me," she had said, "and if they do, the rest of the county will come for him." In the morning, the wind had changed. Clouds rolled in from the west, deep and heavy, carrying the smell of rain and something else. Perhaps smoke, though it was faint enough to only be a guess. Nita had got up early and crouched outside by the fire pit, cooking a small pan of cornbread, as she had done 100 times before. Halon stepped out onto the porch with his coffee and watched her. She moved without hesitation, as if she belonged there. "You've done this before," he said. She looked up, a slight twitch appearing at the corner of her mouth. "I've been to places where you either live or die." He didn't press further. At around noon, the first riders arrived. They weren't the ones Nita had mentioned, not yet, at least, but rather townspeople who were half curious and half looking for a reason to cause trouble. Martha Riggins from the store had brought a jar of preserves with her to see for herself. Old Ben Hartley, who had fought in countless skirmishes, leaned on his cane in the yard and asked pointed questions about the girl's people. Hallen evaded them with calm responses, but could feel Nita's quiet tension increasing with each visitor. She mostly stayed inside, but Hallen once caught her at the window, watching the riders come and go. By evening, only Sheriff Lottom remained in the yard, his hat pulled low over his face and rain dripping from its brim. He didn't smile. "I hear you have someone here who may be connected to what happened out at Cruchtf," he said. Hallen remained calm. "She has nothing to do with it." "Maybe, but you know how people are. If word gets out that she's here, lots of people will turn up at your door demanding that you hand her over. I can't prevent that if it happens. Then I'll have to take care of it myself." The sheriff looked him over for a long moment, then tipped his hat and rode off into the rain. Inside, Nita sat by the fire. The tattoo on her wrist caught the light. She didn't ask what the sheriff had said. There was no need. Outside, the rain began to fall harder, pelting the roof and drowning out the sound of a horse approaching from the darkness, a rider who was not from the town. The hoofbeats came slowly and deliberately, each one muffled by the wet earth. Hallen stepped to the window and lifted the curtain just enough to see the figure in the rain. The rider was wrapped in smooth, dark oilcloth and had pulled the brim of his hat low over his face. The horse, a slender bay, moved beneath him. Steam rose from its nostrils in the cool air. The man did not call out or dismount. He just sat there and watched the hut through the curtain of rain. Nita rose silently from her chair and went to the door. "Stay inside," Hallen said quietly. She stopped. Her gaze was fixed on the shadow outside. "It's not him." "Who is it?" She narrowed her eyes. "It's a spear. They're close." Hal felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Close could mean miles on the open prairie, or just minutes. He put down his coffee and stepped out onto the porch. The rain instantly soaked the brim of his hat and ran down his neck, feeling cold. The rider looked at him for a long time, then lifted his chin slightly. Inside the hut, Hal saw something glinting on the man's coat. A strip of black and red patterned fabric. He recognized it. Years ago, he had seen it among the Mescalero Apaches, not as decoration, but as a silent message passed from hand to hand. It signified a message. It meant that someone had been dispatched. The rider's voice was quiet, almost swallowed by the rain. "You have her." Hallen's jaw tensed. "You must be more specific." The man did not smile. "She is claimed." The horse stamped restlessly in the mud. The rider tugged on the reins once and then steered his horse wordlessly towards the dark horizon. Within seconds, he had disappeared into the rain. Hallen stood on the porch for a moment, scanning the gray fields and listening for more hoofbeats, but there were none. There were none. As he stepped back inside, Anita watched him. What did he say? "That you're being picked up." She smiled slowly and humorlessly. "I told you they were coming." By morning, the rain had stopped, but the prairie lay shrouded in a damp, heavy silence. Fog hung over the low-lying areas, and the air smelled of wet earth and something slightly metallic, as it sometimes did after a nearby lightning strike. Hallen saddled his horse early to search the ridge. Nita was already awake, sitting cross-legged on the floor next to the fire and mending a tear in her dress with a needle and thread that she had found on Hallen's shelf. "Go out there," she said without looking up, "and you'll see them." "You mean your people?" Her hands moved steadily. "Not my people anymore. But yes, they will watch. They always watch before they move." It was the before that he didn't like. At around noon, Amos Whitbright returned, this time without pretense. He rode up quickly, not bothering to tie his horse, and stomped up the porch. "They're out there, Hal.
Amos said in a deep but sharp voice. 5, maybe 6 riders were spotted near the dry creek bed. McBride swore he had seen smoke signals in the west. Hallen didn't answer right away. Amos stepped closer. If you keep them here, you'll ruin us all. This isn't about kindness anymore. It's about survival. Hand her over to whoever is looking for her, and maybe they'll move on. Nita was now standing in the doorway. Her face was calm, but her eyes were like steel. They won't ride on, she said. Amos eyed her as if she were a rattlesnake about to strike. And why is that? Because they didn't come for me, she replied. They came for him. Him, Hallen nodded. The words hit him harder than he had expected. Amos's gaze pierced him. Distrust and curiosity fought for dominance on his face. What is she talking about? Hallen shook his head once. It's none of your business, Amos. Damn it, I wake up at night to the sound of war cries. Go home, he said in a toneless voice. Lock your doors. Amos stared for a moment, then spat in the dirt and stormed off. His horse kicked up mud as he rode away. Late in the afternoon, the sound was faint but clear in the silence of the prairie. This time it was neither the sound of hooves nor the wind. It was drums, slow, steady, and far away but getting closer. Nita walked silently to the window. Hallen joined her. On the distant ridge, which was just visible through the thinning fog, dark figures sat on their horses in a row, motionless. They didn't need to hurry. They knew exactly where he was. The standoff had begun. The drums beat in slow, steady waves like the rhythm of a distant heart. Every few minutes the drums fell silent, and the silence pressed even harder before returning to the steady rhythm, like the ticking of a clock that would eventually run down. Hallen stood on the porch with his hands on the railing and his gaze fixed on the prince. The figures remained where they were, dark against the pale sky. Their horses were restless, but they did not break formation. Inside, Nita moved purposefully, gathering her few belongings, almost nothing, and placing them in a small bundle next to the fireplace. Do you think they'll come tonight? He asked, not looking at her. They'll wait until they're sure you understand. Understand what? That you have no choice. He turned to her. She was standing with her arms crossed now, the faint tattoo on her wrist catching the fading light from the window. I already told you, she continued. It's not about me anymore. Then what is it about? Her gaze remained unflinching. Debt. That word penetrated him more deeply than any warning Amos McBride had ever given him. Hallen knew all about debt in the West. Not only that it wasn't always paid in coins, but also that debts involving blood had a habit of lasting for years without accruing interest. In the late afternoon, the sky changed from pale gray to a deep, shining gold as the sun set. The ridge was now empty. The riders had disappeared as if they had never been there. But the drums had not stopped. In fact, they had grown louder.
Nita stepped out onto the porch beside him and let her gaze wander over the wide plain. They're testing you, she said. They want to see if you'll run away. Hallen pressed his lips together. Not in my nature. Her gaze flicked to him. Is that why you're still alive? It was almost dark when the next visitor arrived. Sheriff Lathem's horse was drenched in sweat and his oilcloth coat was splattered with mud. He swung himself out of the saddle and strode onto the porch without knocking. They're close, Hallen, he said quietly but urgently. I saw 3 spears near the bend in the river. That's not just a guard, they're positioning themselves. That's what I thought. The sheriff's gaze slid past Hallen to Nita, who was standing in the doorway. If you want her, you can't keep her here. The whole piece of land could end up caught up in it. Do you think handing her over will solve the problem? Hallen asked. Maybe it won't, Nita said from the doorway. Latham turned abruptly,
"And how do you know that?" "Because they came to get him," she replied calmly. The sheriff's gaze returned to Hallen. "Is that true?" Hallen didn't answer, and his silence was Ladom's only response. He sighed and ran his hand over his face. "You have until tomorrow," he said finally. "If you're not there by then, come to me in town and we'll find something. But don't think you can stop a dozen warriors on your own." With that, he swung himself back into the saddle and rode off into the gathering twilight. Night fell deep over the prairie, mouthless and silent. The only light came from the fire and the occasional flash of lightning far to the west. Hallen sat at the table, cleaning his rifle with slow, methodical movements. Opposite him, Nita sat with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. "Will you tell me why?" he finally asked. She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was soft yet firm. "Narte dudon koyot." The image came uninvited.
He saw the rock walls, the smoke, the heat of the flames, the cries in a language he didn't understand, and a girl's hand pulling him into the shadows. "I remember," he said. "You shouldn't have come out that night," she said. "Someone else should have done it, but you were in the way, and I chose you." Hallen's hands remained on the rifle. "Chose me." She nodded once. "The one I left behind was the son of their leader." The words hung in the air like the slow fall of a tightening noose. "This time," she said, touching her wrist, "it's not just a symbol, it's a promise, a life for a life. I broke it, and they've been hunting me ever since." Hallen leaned back. The chair creaked under his weight. "So now they have found you." "No," she said quietly. "They found us." The first sound came shortly after midnight. This time it wasn't drumming. It was the distant crack of a rifle. Hallen immediately got up and went to the window. In the distance, faint muzzle flashes lit up the darkness, followed by more shots, this time closer. Nita stood beside him, her voice low. "They're not shooting at us. They're letting us know they're there." Another flash, another bang, then silence. Hallen turned away from the window and checked the door handle. "Get your things. When they come, I don't want you here." She didn't move. "When they come, they're not here for me to leave. They're here for you to stay." Her words hit him harder than the cold wind blowing through the shutters. An hour passed, then another. The fire burned down, casting long shadows on the walls of the hut. Out in the darkness somewhere, an owl hooted once, then twice, and fell silent. Hallen's eyes grew heavy as he heard the hoofbeats, but they were different to before. There were many horses, moving as one horse at a walk. He got up and went to the window. Figures emerged from the darkness. Riders, a dozen or more, slowly spread out in a semicircle around the hut. They didn't shout or draw weapons. They just sat there in the moonless darkness and watched. Nita got up and went to the door, her hand on the bolt. "What are you doing?" Hallen asked. "They're not talking to you," she replied. "Only with me?" He grabbed her arm. "If you go out there, they'll kill us both." Their gazes met, and he saw no fear in hers, only the same quiet determination he remembered from that night at Koicha. Slowly, he let go of her arm. She stepped out into the night. The faint light of the fire fell across her shoulders. The horsemen did not move. Somewhere in their ranks, a single torch flared up, its light catching the glimmer of painted faces and silver ornaments. A man dismounted from the middle of the row and approached them. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with long braided hair and a strip of patterned fabric tied around his upper arm. When he stopped, the night seemed to grow even quieter. They spoke softly, their words too quiet for Hal to hear. Then suddenly, the man's gaze wandered past Nita to the hut and fixed on Hallen. In that silent moment, Hallen understood that he was part of whatever decision was being made out there in the dark, whether he wanted to be or not.
The man said something sharply, to which Nita replied with a single word. Then she turned back to the hut, her face expressionless. "They want you to come out," she said. Hallin's grip on the rifle tightened. "And if not, they'll come in," she said. Her voice remained calm, but in the light of the torch, he could see her fingers trembling slightly. He had made the decision, but it wasn't really a decision at all. The night air hit him like cold iron as he stepped onto the porch. The light from the horsemen's torches cast sharp shadows on the ground, making their faces appear and disappear like ghosts. Nita stood quietly and upright to one side, her few belongings in a bundle at her feet. The man who had spoken to her, taller than the others, with a stony countenance, watched Hal with the unshakable patience of someone who had already decided how the night would end. Hallin stepped down from the porch. His boots sunk slightly into the damp ground. The circle of riders moved closer together, closing in. The creaking of leather and the soft clinking of reins filled the silence. The man at the front spoke first. "Are you Hal Crow?" It was not a question. Hal's voice remained calm. "I am." "You remember Kuter Reich?" Again, not a question. The memories came uninvited. He could see smoke and feel the heat, and he could sense the weight of the stones under his hands as he crawled through that narrow escape route. He could also hear the voice of the girl behind him urging him to keep going. She was the girl who now stood in the dark and watched. "I remember," he said. The man's gaze remained fixed. "My brother died there." Hallin looked at Nita. Her face was pale in the torchlight, but her eyes were steady and fixed on the man. "He shouldn't have died," she said quietly. The man clenched his teeth. "No, he shouldn't have." A long, heavy silence spread between them, laden with all the years that had passed and all the things that had never been said. Finally, the man looked back at Hallin. "You live because she saved you. She lives because she fled. That is the debt." Hallin shifted his weight. "So what happens now? You kill us both and we're even." The man's expression did not change. "Blood for blood is the way of things, but sometimes the debt can be paid in other ways." He stepped closer. The light from the torch reflected off the silver beads in his braids. "You took her from the whites in your town. You claimed her for yourself. Will you stand up for her now, knowing that the fight won't end here?" Hal felt the question settle like a stone in his stomach. Behind him lay the hut that he had built with his own hands, and the quiet life he had created for himself, in a land that forgave no mistakes. In front of him were a dozen men who could burn everything down before dawn. Between them stood Nita, whose life had once crossed his in a way that neither of them had chosen, but which had shaped them both. He looked at her, and for the first time since that day at the auction, she looked directly at him. There was no defiance or challenge, just the simple truth of someone who knew exactly what was at stake. He turned back to the man. "I vouch for her." The circle of horsemen stirred, and murmurs rose. The man raised a hand, and the noise died down. "You understand what this means," he said. "Shah?" His gaze rested on her for a long moment. Then he turned to her. "You saved him once. Now he is saving you. The debt is paid." He said it simply, as if stating the time, but the meaning was unmistakable. The man stepped back and signaled to his horsemen. The semicircle broke up, opening onto the dark prairie. Nita's shoulders slumped, the first sign of relief she had shown all night. She bent down to pick up her bundle, but Hallin was already beside her, taking it from her hands. The horsemen set off and disappeared into the darkness as quietly as they had appeared. The drums had fallen silent. When the last torch disappeared over the hill, the night seemed unbearably quiet. The fire in the hut burned steadily but weakly. Hallin placed Nita's brindle next to the bed and poured 2 cups of coffee. For a long time, however, neither of them touched it. She sat in the chair by the table and stared into the flames. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did." Her gaze turned to him. He considered lying, saying something simple and practical, but the truth was becoming increasingly difficult to utter. Because you pulled me out of Coyote Reach unnecessarily, and I've been carrying that night around with me ever since. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked away and absent-mindedly stroked the tattoo on her wrist. They won't bother you anymore. Are you sure about that? Yes, it's over. But her voice trailed off, and for the first time since he had known her, she seemed uncertain. You're going to get in trouble with your own people now. Some won't forget that you stood up for me. I've had trouble before. That brought a slight smile to her lips. The following days were quiet. The riders had left, the ridge was empty again, and the prairie was wide and silent. However, the townspeople had noticed. Martha Ridgens no longer brought canned goods. Amos McCready kept his distance. His gaze was hard when he met Hal in town. The sheriff said nothing, but there was a new heaviness to his look at Nita when their paths crossed. It didn't matter. They found a rhythm. She mended his shirts without being asked. He showed her where the creek was deep enough for fishing. Some evenings they talked to each other, on others they let the silence be.